When Rome collapsed, the people who truly survived weren't the rich. They were the ones who owned these four things. If you really watch this story all the way through, you may completely change the way you think about money, assets, real estate, gold, debt, work, and even security itself. Because most people think Rome was destroyed by barbarians. But when historians seriously studied the collapse, they discovered something else. Rome did not die from invasion first. Rome died from its money. More specifically, it died from something every modern nation eventually repeats: printing money. And the frightening part is this: the modern world is starting to look more and more like late-stage Rome. So today, I want to talk about this differently, not like some expert lecturing from above, but as an ordinary person, a viewer, someone who also spends time thinking about how to build wealth, how to protect it, how not to get crushed by the next major shift. And together, I want us to explore one question. When an entire civilization starts shaking, what actually survives? If you enjoy content about history, wealth, collapse, and survival, drop a like before we begin, because this may genuinely be one of the most important financial perspective shifts you hear this year, especially the final section. Because it explains something history keeps repeating: why some people become poorer during collapse, while others quietly become even wealthier. Part 1. Rome wasn't just powerful, it was the ancient world's superpower. I think many people underestimate how enormous Rome actually was. Rome was not just another kingdom. It was essentially the United States of the ancient world. At its peak, the empire controlled Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. Its population approached 70 million people, from Britain to Syria, from Egypt to Gaul. The Mediterranean Sea was practically a Roman lake. Rome had an elite military, advanced infrastructure, sophisticated trade routes, a massive financial system. Even today, many modern governments still inherit ideas originally shaped by Rome: legal systems, taxation structures, administrative organization. Rome became so dominant that many Romans genuinely believed the empire would last forever. But history has a strange habit. Everything humans believe is permanent eventually disappears. And before Rome collapsed, something extremely important happened. Money itself started losing value. Part 2. What really destroyed Rome wasn't war, it was monetary collapse. Most people grow up hearing the simplified version. Rome fell because barbarians invaded. But that was the final stage, not the real cause. The deeper problem was that the empire had already begun rotting from within.
And the first thing that started collapsing was the currency system. Rome's primary currency was the Denarius silver coin. Originally, it contained around 95% silver, which meant something very important. The coin itself possessed real intrinsic value. People trusted it. Merchants trusted it. Soldiers trusted it. The entire Roman economy functioned because people believed in the integrity of that money. But eventually, Rome encountered a familiar problem. The empire became too large. Wars became too expensive. Borders became difficult to defend. The military consumed enormous resources. And the government slowly realized tax revenue was no longer enough. So Roman emperors did what governments throughout history eventually do when trapped financially. They debased the currency. At first, the silver content quietly dropped. 95%, then 70%, then 50%. Eventually, less than 5%. On the surface, the coin still looked identical. But underneath, most of the silver had been replaced with cheap bronze. And this is the terrifying part. Most ordinary people did not notice immediately, because the numbers stayed the same. Your salary still said 100, but the purchasing power behind that number had already collapsed. Sound familiar? Because throughout history, currency destruction almost never happens instantly. It happens gradually, quietly, one layer at a time, until suddenly everyone realizes the money no longer works. The Romans noticed eventually.
And once they did, the entire system began unraveling. Merchants stopped accepting coins. Prices exploded upward. Soldiers demanded higher wages. Food shortages spread. Trade routes fractured. Farmers abandoned land. Black markets emerged. And slowly, the empire lost control. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about collapse is this. They think civilizations fail suddenly, but they usually don't. Collapse typically happens in two phases. First, everyone insists the problems are manageable. Then, everything breaks all at once. That is exactly what happened to Rome. It decayed slowly, then collapsed suddenly. And honestly, the more I studied this period, the more uncomfortable it became, because many modern economies are showing disturbingly similar patterns. Part 3. Romans began realizing paper wealth was an illusion. Once the currency system started failing, something psychologically devastating happened. People realized their life savings were evaporating. Imagine saving money for 20 years, only to discover it can barely buy food. That was late-stage Rome. And this is where the smartest people in society made a critical decision. They escaped the currency. They began converting wealth into gold. But there is an important detail most people miss. Not all gold was considered trustworthy. The truly valuable gold was verifiable gold, because even during Rome's decline, counterfeit precious metals spread everywhere. Fake gold coins.
Manipulated weights, adulterated bars. So eventually the market only trusted gold that could be weighed, tested, verified independently, exchanged without relying on government promises. And this reveals something timeless about human civilization. At the end of every monetary crisis, people return to the oldest form of trust. Not, the government says this is valuable, but this thing is valuable by itself. That is why Constantine's introduction of the Solidus gold coin became so important. The coin maintained stable purity, stable weight, reliable consistency. Merchants trusted it again. International trade revived. Wealthy families stored wealth in it. Meanwhile, those who continued holding debased silver coins were financially destroyed. And honestly, when I first learned this, one uncomfortable question immediately entered my mind. How different is our modern monetary system from late Rome? Today's currencies are not backed by gold, can be created endlessly, depend entirely on institutional confidence. In some ways, modern money may actually be even more abstract than Roman money during collapse. Maybe that is why so many people today are instinctively moving toward things that cannot be printed. Gold, land, energy, Bitcoin, scarce assets. Because humans naturally run toward things that cannot be infinitely replicated. Part 4, the most mind-blowing part. Debt became wealth. This section completely changed the way I think about money.
Because it overturns everything most people are taught. From childhood, we hear, debt is dangerous, borrowing is irresponsible, saving is safe. But during Rome's collapse, many of the people who preserved wealth were actually heavily in debt. Why? Because inflation destroyed the value of the currency itself. Imagine a Roman aristocrat borrowing 100,000 denarii in 200 AD to purchase land. At that time, the debt represented a fortune. But decades later, inflation had devastated the currency. Legally, he still owed 100,000 denarii, but those coins now possessed only a fraction of their former purchasing power. In other words, inflation quietly erased the real burden of the debt. Meanwhile, who suffered most? The savers, the retirees, the creditors, the people living on fixed income. Because inflation slowly drained away their purchasing power. This was the moment I finally understood why many modern billionaires use enormous amounts of debt. Because they understand something most people don't. The real question is not the size of the debt. The real question is the quantity of the currency the debt is denominated in. If money continuously loses value, fixed-rate debt can become an extraordinary wealth transfer mechanism. Which is exactly why, during periods of cheap money and aggressive monetary expansion, many wealthy people became richer by borrowing heavily to buy real assets.
History keeps repeating the same pattern. Currencies weaken, assets rise, debt holders survive, cash savers suffer. Part 5. The people who truly survived were the ones who could function independently. This may be the section that feels most relevant today, because Rome's collapse revealed something terrifying about complex systems. At its height, Rome depended on massive interconnected trade networks. Egyptian grain fed Roman cities. Spanish olive oil moved across Europe. Middle Eastern dyes supplied elite clothing. The system was incredibly sophisticated. But once instability spread, that complexity became fragility, and suddenly many wealthy landowners discovered something shocking. Their land no longer generated value because trade collapsed, transportation weakened, markets disappeared, cities declined. The estates that survived all shared one characteristic: self-sufficiency. These estates produced internally food, tools, clothing, livestock, materials. Some functioned almost like miniature nations, and when the outside world destabilized, they remained relatively stable. Honestly, this part hit me hard, because modern civilization feels extremely similar. Today, all of us depend on electricity, cloud infrastructure, logistics systems, global supply chains, internet networks, semiconductors, energy imports. And the frightening reality is this: modern society is incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile. The pandemic already exposed this once. For the first time, millions of people realized stability is much thinner than it appears.
Part 6. In the end, the most valuable asset was an irreplaceable skill. This may be the most important lesson of all, because it directly connects to the future. When Rome collapsed, many prestigious professions instantly lost value. Imperial administrators, government officials, legal bureaucrats, institutional experts. Why? Because the institutions themselves collapsed. But some people remained valuable no matter what happened. Doctors, blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, merchants capable of operating across regions. Why? Because they solved real human problems, not institutional problems. And honestly, this feels extremely relevant in the age of AI. The people most at risk in the future may not necessarily be the poor. It may be people whose entire value depends on systems that are becoming obsolete. AI is already replacing enormous amounts of standardized work. Repetitive analysis, administrative labor, information processing, middle-layer knowledge work. Meanwhile, skills becoming more valuable may include creativity, persuasion, leadership, audience building, adaptability, AI collaboration, real-world craftsmanship, human trust. In other words, the future may reward people who can still create value outside institutional structures, which is almost exactly what happened during Rome's decline. Part 7. The real warning Rome left behind. The more I studied Rome, the less it felt like ancient history, and the more it felt like a warning about the future. Because today, we are also living through an era of rising debt, increasingly abstract money, inflated asset prices, weakening middle classes, widening inequality, fragile supply chains, and the most dangerous part is this: most people still believe the system will remain stable forever. But every civilization believed that. Rome believed it, Britain believed it, the Soviet Union believed it. History repeatedly shows that no system is permanent. So the real question is not, will the world change? The real question is, when change arrives, what do you own that still matters? Part 8. If Rome happened today, what would actually survive? If I had to summarize the Roman lesson from an ordinary person's perspective, it would be this. First, do not rely entirely on paper wealth, because currencies can be diluted. Second, real wealth usually exists in things that cannot be infinitely created, such as gold, land, energy, scarce resources, Bitcoin, brands, attention, networks. Third, complex systems eventually become fragile. True security may come from cash flow, adaptability, productive capability, partial independence. And fourth, the most important asset is still yourself, especially your ability to learn, ability to adapt, ability to create, ability to remain useful in changing systems. Because throughout history, the people who survive collapse are rarely the people with the highest status inside the system.
They are usually the people who still matter after the system changes. Final thoughts. When Rome was collapsing, many people still believed the empire would recover. They watched the currency weaken. They watched prices rise. They watched instability spread. And they still believed things will probably return to normal. Every civilization tells itself that story. Until suddenly, it can't anymore. Empires rarely die overnight. First, they lose real value. Then they lose trust. Then, eventually, they lose the future itself. And the people who successfully move through history are usually not the most optimistic or the most pessimistic. They are the ones who recognize earliest what still holds real value when everything else becomes uncertain.